All right, good evening everybody, and thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to another EOSphere meetup here at Stone and Chalk, hosted by the Blockchain Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. Thank you for another Blockchain Centre event here, and who's ever been to one of our Blockchain Centre events? Very few, fantastic. So, who's never been? Who's never been to a Blockchain Centre? You've been to one of our Blockchain Centre events. But there's a lot of you who haven't been to a Blockchain Centre event, so that's fantastic for you to come here and see and talk. So let me talk to you about what Blockchain Centre is. We are a knowledge and community hub, and our mission is to accelerate the global adoption of blockchain technology. How we do this is education, incubation, and community events. So we have the weekly Talk and Trade, where every week we talk about the current markets and what's happened in the past week about cryptocurrency and blockchain. So these are our Crypto Monday events. Please go look into our website and Eventbrite and Meetup, and you'll see all the events that we have. These are what's coming up. 5th of December was last night. 6th of December, we've got the EOSphere Meetup. The 12th of December is our Talk and Trade, which is going to be our last Talk and Trade, where we're going to have a sort of a end-of-year celebration and party for all the support of all the people that's come to our events this year. On the 13th of December, we have a Hobby Member Christmas Party. So if you are a Hobby member or would like to be going to that Christmas party, please become a Hobby member. And on the 17th of December, we've got Women in Blockchain end-of-year celebrations. Again, Meetup and Eventbrite. Our education that we provide here is blockchain, cryptocurrency, and developers course, and these are some of the startups that work throughout our center. So we've got quite a few people working on different applications and adoption of blockchain here. So you've got AIM, which is accounting, Betterme, which is health, SUP, hospitality, Blockgrains, agriculture, Emmy is carbon emission reductions, Tillbilly's point of sale, Value X is music, and Me is social media, who's trying to combat all the different fake news out there and see if they can match Facebook and Twitter. We do have a VIP program for events, and we are active in social media, so if you do want to see what's been going on, please go look through all our accounts and hashtag blockchain_CTR. We are a not-for-profit, so we wouldn't be here with some of our sponsors, IBM, DigiJX, Blockchain Global, and Hobby Australia. And some of our other industry partners here, plus our venue partner, Stone and Chalk, who's providing this beautiful venue here, which is an old warehouse, train warehouse. If you see above me, these are some of the old train doors over here. I don't think this one is. I think it's, but these are all the old train doors over there. So let me now introduce the host of this evening, which is the EOSphere meetup. And I don't know, what do you call people who are EOSphere members? EOSpherians? All right. So let me introduce the new EOSphere, and here is Chris P.
Thanks a lot, guys, for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the pizza and the beer. What was I going to say? So, I'm Chris from EOSphere. I'm one of the community liaison members of EOSphere. We are an Australian block producer, which sounds very obscure, and hopefully maybe by the end of the night you might have some idea what that actually means. I'm not going to explain it now. Tonight we have some special people. We have a few people from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub, and we also have an international guest who I pre-recorded just because I thought it might be a little bit risky to do it live, who will be sort of coming interweaving into the conversation as we go. Tonight is about economics, the economics of blockchain, and the problem of governance. We may refer to EOS at times, but this panel's not really about EOS in particular. It's really about blockchain. And my personal sort of hope for tonight would be that some of you who aren't that familiar with blockchain technology come away thinking that blockchain technology may not just be a technology. So that's really something that I hope you can take away from it. Just to get a little bit of a survey, can I get a show of hands? Who has been to any sort of meetup about a blockchain before? Okay, so 50, 70%. Who works in the field of law? Okay, 4. Who works in business? Okay, a little bit more. Who works in technology? Even more. We see the hands going up a couple of times. And who works in the blockchain field specifically? Okay, great. Who owns some cryptocurrency? Okay, what's that, 50% maybe?
49.
49? Okay. So basically the format for tonight is an hour of a panel discussion. So if you do have questions, write them down. If it does get, if it's just burning up inside of you and you have to get it out, then we might have to start a Q&A. But the Q&A will be after the discussion. And what was I going to say? I've got a few questions, but basically it should be pretty free-flowing. So if any of you guys want to interject or ask questions or get into something, go down a rabbit hole, then feel free. So to start us off, Jason, could I ask you to just sort of tell us who you are? And then we'll go down the line.
Yes, I'm Jason Potts. I'm a professor of economics at RMIT University and director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub. Also president of the Worldwide Blockchain Innovation Association, which is an association we formed to try and coordinate blockchain trade zones. So we're essentially an education institution, a research institute, but with a lot of policy focus that we're trying to do.
Thanks, Jason. Alastair?
Hi everyone, I'm Alastair Berg. I'm a researcher at the Hub under Jason. I'm also a PhD student. I'm a research fellow at the WBIA, which Jason just mentioned. And I'm also a founding member of the International Society for the Study of Decentralized Governance as well, which Jason also is, but he forgot. It's quite new, so he hasn't learnt it yet. And that's me.
Mikayla.
And finally, I'm Mikayla Novak. I'm sitting in for Chris Berg tonight, so there's Chris Berg fans. Very sorry about that, but I'll try to contribute something positive. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub, obviously working alongside Al here, and Jason, I'm an academic fellow of the WBIA, the Worldwide Blockchain Innovation Association. And that very much links very closely to the work that I focus on in the sort of blockchain space, which is to essentially intersect blockchain economics with public policy. So that's my forte, but not the exclusive one. So lovely to be here.
Thanks, Mikayla. And now I'll just introduce Thomas Cox, who's our international guest.
I was brought in as a general purpose person because we were in a wonderful hurry to get as much done as quickly as we could. And it quickly became clear that I didn't know C++ and therefore couldn't do anything useful like coding. So I ended up taking on things like vice president of product and governance, all the governance bits, since they were parts of that were coded, of course, in C++, but a lot of it was declarative. And so my background at working at Oracle and learning about, traditional databases, including traditional distributed databases, came in really handy, as did my degree in psychology and my having run for governor of my state once upon a time, and my longtime fascination with game theory, all that, irrelevant nonsense that you think, oh, I'll never need all this. And it all turned out to be at least somewhat useful.
So I thought to start us off, we would maybe try and get everyone on the same page by actually talking about what the hell is a blockchain. And especially from an economist point of view, I'd really like to hear what is a blockchain?
So the way I talk about it now is just actually completely ignore the technology and just go straight to what it does. And what it does, to me, the essence of what a blockchain is it's a mechanism to establish social consensus about facts, truth. And that's what it does, right? That's the why do you want a blockchain to do something? It's a technology that is a new way of doing a thing that we've needed to do for about 5,000 years. And lots of mechanisms and institutions that we have for establishing social consensus about facts are the bedrock and basis of everything that is institutional, or everything that is in the economy, or everything that requires politics, or just anything that requires a group of people coming together and organizing themselves. Requires social agreement about facts. Who is that person? Who owns that cow? Who just sold that cow to who? Who is allowed to stand on the whatever committee? All of those things are not properties of the universe. They're not, physics will never discover any of those things. They're created social facts, and those social facts give us things like property, ownership, contracts, building blocks of the economy. Now, how we normally do those is that's what a ledger is. A ledger is literally where you write down those social facts, and the idea of social agreement about them is there's one book, it's the official book, it's organized by the whatever has power in society to hold that book. And just that notion is what a blockchain is a new solution to. And the idea of what we mean by its decentralized technology is that means instead of using power to control social facts, we can use another thing, protocols, proof of work, all these other sort of technological mechanisms coming in. But wherever, it's just sort of seeing it in that way, what that does is it just gives you a sense that this is everywhere. This is not a fintech thing. This is everything that involves the economy is built upon this. Most of the things that involve culture and society at some level involve this. So the scope and application of this technology is absolutely epochal, right? This is a whole new era has just opened up. Now, what we don't know is what we're going to use it for, whether we use it for some of the things that we need social facts agreements on, all of them, some of them, just those ones, not those ones, that's uncertain. But the idea that we can, that's the phase we're in now, is trying to figure that out and experiment with that. So, I mean, I sort of, we can talk about the underlying technology which comes out of, maths and cryptography and database engineering and peer-to-peer networking and all of these things. But none of that is actually essential to understand the importance of the technology, which is building blocks for the basic infrastructure for organizing societies and economies. And when people also have this moment of, just going, wow, this is huge, that's what they're seeing, this is not interesting from a technological perspective, it is, but it's huge from a long-run historical perspective that, the first time this happened and we figured out how to socially record facts and then make agreements about that, the word for that was civilization, or economies, or history, or one of those sorts of words. We've just done a new technology of that, and to me that's the key insight there. And we're here to talk about governance, and it turns out that once you've got that, the next question is governance. Social agreement about facts. Now we've got the rules by which those social agreements about facts change. That's governance. So again, this is a technological discussion we're going to have about sort of things, but the context of this is absolutely historically fundamental, and I don't think that's hype. I think that's just reality. The fundamental uncertainty we have is Is this tomorrow? Is it the week after? Is it, is it 2020? Is it 2040 that this is really going to? Because the last time it took hundreds of years or thousands of years. Now this is moving incredibly quickly, but that's the bit I don't know. It's just how all we can do is go on. Oh, sorry, not all we can do. We can't actually base our understanding of when on the other technology diffusion curves because none of us have ever lived through, or none of our parents or their parents or any of our recent ancestors have ever lived through a technological shift like this. So we sort of have to rely, the standard adoption diffusion curves of things like the internet or electricity are kind of guidelines, but they're not actually that relevant because this is actually a much deeper shift. Yeah.
So thanks. So you mentioned that the blockchains are basically a ledger. Could you or someone sort of talk us through, you briefly mentioned sort of the history of ledgers, but could you talk us through those stages of how ledgers actually, how they evolved?
Yeah, so Jason alluded to it, but blockchain's done some pretty amazing things for us, just the way that we think about the world. So now everyone knows what a central bank does, why it exists. I mean, now people are questioning whether or not they should exist. People are thinking about the role of money in society just because of blockchain and, because of Bitcoin, really. But what blockchain technologies also made us think about is the role of ledgers. So now, and again, Jason alluded to this, but we now have a ledger-centric view of the economy of society and political systems as well. So ledgers allow us to record facts, but that's actually really epochal when it comes to civilization. So once we invented writing, and we invented writing in Mesopotamia and Egypt, in China at all similar times, but once that happened, we had civilization. We had large empires. So we had large trading empires where facts could be recorded. But of course, because it was quite primitive, we were restricted by technology. It was just writing and things were very far away when it's hard to travel places. We needed big militaries and strong men and kings and queens to govern it. We didn't have anything else apart from that until double entry bookkeeping. And then after that, we've had global capitalism, which is what we've had up until this stage. And now we see just an entire new way to do ledgers. So now we can do ledgers without any emperor, without any corporation in charge, without any government in charge. We can do it completely decentralized. And we can essentially govern ourselves as a group of users with rules that we agree amongst ourselves without relying on anyone to be in charge. So this has taught us that ledgers are basically everything, and the way that we operationalise ledgers and the way that we govern these ledgers influences what the world looks like.
Just to add to that, if I may. So I think it's quite important to sort of posit the existence and the history of this technology called ledgers, which is just merely a humbling sort of statement of facts with the sort of civilizational project of statecraft, which has unfolded for thousands of years, right? So, so what is a polity? A polity is a technology as to how we sort of organise and coordinate ourselves in the mutual interests for public benefit. Now, a quintessential fundament of that has been these sort of records of facts. Now, there's an anthropologist and political scientist, James C. Scott, who wrote a famous book called Seeing Like a State, where he records, the historical development of ledgers as expressed through the emergence of surnames, property titles, and other sort of facts that relate to individual and groups' ability to sort of generate revenue, right? So agricultural yields, right? There's records of those. These are all sort of aspects, right, of ledgers as broadly conceived. Now, the sort of the genius and the opportunity and the challenge of blockchain is that it's posited that it would challenge that project of statecraft, which has become very hierarchical and very centralized in its sort of features, just by its very nature of the blockchain itself. It's decentralized, it's collaborative, it provides a sort of system of programming codes and programming protocols which allow to substitute, some elements for trust for others, which, incidentally sort of question, put under some sort of question the notion of the merit of statecraft itself. And the reason why we sort of question out, the reason why blockchain does question that, is that we know that, as big and large and as seemingly almighty as the modern state, the high modernist state has become, it is susceptible, to the data that it, hoovers up from the populace is susceptible to, fraud, hacking, malfeasance, error, theft, and these have actually quite deleterious implications for people's lives, right? The single point of attack that these centralized hierarchicalist establishments, they can, in some extent, actually hurt people, right? Quite directly. And the potential beauty of blockchain, we would hypothesize, is the ability to sort of step away from those highly centralized, hierarchical institutions of statecraft built over eons to something new, something more collaborative, something ironically more trusting indeed.
Can I just add some more on that? So two observations that come out of that. One is this question: how much of the world is actually made of ledgers? And we've come up with an estimate on this. It turns out no one's ever thought to ask this question. And you say, well, that's just how many accountants are there in the world? But that's not the right way to ask it. The correct way is, what fraction of society's resources and efforts and scarce time is devoted to doing ledger work, which means just time, not just writing things down, but verifying them, checking them, auditing them. And the estimate we came up with, and we can talk later about how we did it, but it shocked us even when we were like, that doesn't even seem right. 35%, almost a third of the economy, which is, in a global sense, $28 trillion, every year, and then again next year. 1 in 3 people's entire lives are devoted to this. That's how much it costs us to just run the infrastructure upon which our civilization and economies are built. Like 1 in 3 people's lives are given to this. Again, the significance of that is that's the potential productivity gain that is there to take from this. So there's that. That's the other sense in which this is huge. The other sort of point I want to make is just to put this into historical context. We've got 5,000 years worth of ledgers, right? We've just suddenly got a new technology that's dropped onto the face of the earth 10 years ago. The best thing that would happen is if we just started again and just like, okay, forget all that, let's build it again. Which is kind of the Ethereum project, it's the EOS project. That's the sort of optimistic. Let's just start again, year zero, build it all over again. It may turn out that that's the best approach, the fastest approach. Unfortunately, the reality is we're doing that, plus the existing system, plus an attempt to take the existing system and craft it into a new system. And that's where most of the uncertainty and trouble and difficulty comes from, because the old centralized ledger processes that we've had 5,000 years to perfect, it's pretty high functioning for what it is. Doesn't want to go into this new system. It's not, the architecture is just completely wrong. So it has to be forced and broken. And the new approach works best in new areas where there isn't anything already. So areas where you don't have law, so crime is a good place to start. Areas of international jurisdiction where their laws are weak, or areas. So there's lots of obvious places to start, but they're the places that look like the wrong places to start, because those are the cracks and gaps that you're trying to fill in. But again, this is the challenge. A year zero, if we started again on Mars, it would be obvious what we should do. But yeah, the problem is we have to start here on Earth.
So just one little sort of two or three sentences just following that. You know, so we have a famous economist named James M. McGill Buchanan, and he basically says that, you know, if we want to sort of basically consider you know, institutional reforms, the way in which we govern ourselves, he, in his words, say, we start from here. And this is why, in my own view, the sort of techno-libertarian dreams of blockchain being able to smash the state is unfortunately, you know, from one's perspective, not feasible. We start from here, we start from a big, you know, almighty sort of state with all the data hoovered up, and this is why blockchain is politically determinative.
Thanks, guys. Because we are starting to talk a lot about governance, I think maybe it's a good time to interject with Thomas's definition of governance.
And my contention is that governance is no more nor less than a system of making collective decisions. Could be anything from how shall we annex new lands to our nation, or, you know, how shall we vote for our king or our president, all the way down to, you know, we're all going to have pizza together. What pizza shall we get? If it's a collective decision, then the making of it falls under the heading of governance, along with carrying out the decision. This is what a lot of people forget, is just because you've, you know, voted or something doesn't mean you're done. Somebody has to then place the pizza order, drive there, pay for it, bring it back. We better have plates and napkins, and how are we all contributing our bit to the bill? And so often corporate governance is, that phrase is used as a drill into the carrying out of decisions clearly and transparently. And that, of course, brings to the surface the principal agent problem, which is all woven through most governance conversations. And then there's a third piece to governance. So we're going to make the collective decision. We're going to carry out the collective decision clearly, transparently, honestly, verifiably. And then we're going to tweak the decision-making rules by which we choose our pizza next time, or whatever the thing is. And we'll make that again in a collective fashion. So we might need, you know, 2/3 of the House and the Senate and 3/4 of all state legislatures to ratify a change to the U.S. Constitution. And that would be tweaking decision-making rules. So there's your definition of governance.
For economists, what Thomas just described there isn't, we don't use the word governance, we use the word institution or constitution. But it's the same thing. It's just a set of, it's a group of people collectively make a set of rules to govern, i.e. now, govern is technically a political or administrative word. In economics, we mean it create a set of incentives under which behavior is aligned in a particular direction. But it's the difference is a little bit significant, because governance in an administrative or government sense implies some kind of sanction if you violate the rules, whereas when economists use the word institution, by which they mean the same thing, what they're really talking about is incentives, designing a set of incentives such that the rational behavior of every citizen or agent in that system is to behave in such a way that you get a good outcome. But it's the common word, whether you use institution or governance, the common word is rules, rule systems. And the idea of, what this looks like in the blockchain context is the protocol. A protocol is a rule system that governs, creates incentives, enables a group of people to coordinate on an outcome, whether that's by creating high-powered incentives to behave in a way, whether that's threat of punishment or in the political sense, or expectation of reward in the economic market sense. It's design of rules. Now, what's also interesting about this is that governance and institutional analysis and so on has really been we've known about it for a long time. There's Nobel Prizes been given to economists for it. There's famous political scientists who have studied this. But generally, it's kind of been regarded as not the most important thing, because the real important thing is market dynamics or economic growth or whatever. And the reason that this has been largely overlooked until now, the reason, we can talk for months on this now, is that it just never changed. It was just a slow-moving thing that was in the background. We've no idea where it came from, but that's what it is, and these are the rules or whatever. The idea that you can design this and then tomorrow we can design a better one, or the idea of thinking of governance as a technology that would have engineers designing it, or that this is a design problem or a technology problem as opposed to just a force of history thing. The idea that it was within our control is what's new. And what blockchain does, what this notion of protocol design or governance problems do, is just bring that front and center for the first time, put it in front of us and go, what governance mechanisms would a society design if they had the choice? Now, you think of America, the famous Constitutional Convention, they did it once, 250 years ago. And then set and forget for 500 years. Minor tweaks. But the point is, it's historical, it's a very special occasion, you get out the best silverware and then you don't touch it for hundreds of years. We've replaced it with let's build one this afternoon, and then if it breaks, we'll build another one tomorrow morning, and we'll just keep doing it till we get a good one that works for us, and we'll have competing ones. And the idea that this governance as a technology, that's what's radically new and exciting, and that's the potential here, I think. Yeah.
It's also important to remember that when we're talking about institutions and governance, it's not just formal rules or formal, it's not just the courthouse which is governing society, or it's not just the parliament which is governing society. It's also things like social norms, cultural norms, and I think that's still important in the blockchain space as well, because there are still people in the meat world building these things, and there are still people who have more influence over communities than other people. I mean, if you look at some of the Bitcoin Cash people, or talking about the ABC versus SV stuff, they're taking Satoshi's vision like he's some prophet. So there are still, there's still informal institutions out there, which I think are still important to think about in the blockchain space.
Agree. It's super important that we acknowledge that governance is not the sole exclusive preserve of the formalised, mechanised and hierarchical government. Very often in practice, what occurs with government and the evolution of government policy is that politicians tend to come pretty much after the fact. Now, when a whole bunch of people emergently and in a bottom-up sense, get together in a mutually beneficial fashion to coordinate, to develop, let's say, a technology or some shared understood rules of the game, that takes place bottom-up, effervescently, and typically government comes along, particularly when these sort of bottom-up rules are adopted by a bulk of the population. They come in right at the last minute and codify them in legislation. So, the predominance of the state leads many of us to casually ignore the informal governance mechanisms that Al talked about. A sort of famous historical example of informal governance is the system of lex mercantoria, which is international law related to trade. Now, a concrete relevant example of informal governance for us is the Nakamoto White Paper, right? A constitution for a decentralized consensus-building mechanism of recording, validating and storing facts on the ground using cryptography, computer science and economic incentive. Now, it's only now, really, over the last sort of couple of years that policymakers have started, the other formal governance have started to take an interest in the informal, very diverse and really fascinating assortments of informal governance that have been built up courtesy of blockchain.
I think you could almost argue that the white paper is now a formal institution.
Yes.
I think.
Just to add to this, the other thing that's happened is that governance has basically become an experimental science. It's never been thought of as an experimental science before, but we just built it into one. And We've got some theory, like, and the theory sort of, people like James Buchanan, as Mikayla was saying, have developed that, and game theory is useful for this, and ideas out of mechanism design. I mean, that's what mechanism design and game theory is basically the underlying theory of how rule systems work around this idea of designing incentives and then studying the equilibria. With this set of rules, you'd expect these particles, these human particles with these hopes and dreams will converge on this point, right? Boom. And that's what game theory is, a way to predict that. But what blockchain protocols are is basically a way to build it and test it, see if that actually works, which is fascinating.
So let's just assume that not everyone knows much about Bitcoin. How would you describe how Bitcoin is governed?
I can have a stab at that. So there's a few elements to the governance of Bitcoin. So in the constitutional stage, so when you set up a country, you have a constitutional stage, or constitutional political economists thought that there was a constitutional stage and a post-constitutional stage. The constitutional stage was just Satoshi Nakamoto writing the white paper, coding it up. He released it to the world, or she, or they, or it may have been an alien, we're not sure. That's the first part of Bitcoin, and that was just, for months or 6 months or a year afterwards, that was it. The two other parts of institutions or governance with Bitcoin is the longest chain rule. So miners are incentivized to only put blocks on the longest chain. But then the other part is what you might consider the post-constitutional stage, or the constitutional entrepreneurship, where people are trying to tweak the protocol, trying to improve how the protocol works. And this is how we're getting forks, and this is how we're getting altcoins, with all new different types of cryptocurrencies, which have all very slightly different protocols to Bitcoin.
For those who don't know, what's a fork?
A fork is basically where you Control C on a protocol, on a cryptocurrency, change a very small part of it, and then it's a new cryptocurrency.
In the political world, a fork is secession, where you declare war and you secede and you make your own rules that are different from the rules that you left. So America was a fork from Britain.
And sorry, can I just go back to try to make a link with the broader sort of governance question? In effect, what we're sort of seeing with all the different applications and assortments of, cryptocurrencies and sort of blockchain-enabled sort of voting mechanisms. You see the EOSpheres of this world and other establishments. You're effectively seeing in governance something of a so-called Cambrian explosion, right, of different styles of governance and experiments. What do I mean by that? Well, think about sort of prehistory in the Cambrian age, when the Earth was still young. That was the period in which life form, boom, just sparked up, right? Leading to biological evolution that has unfolded henceforth. And we're seeing adaptations of, for example, Bitcoin. And other applications of blockchain which have that kind of character.
So we've just mixed two metaphors there, but I think it's important to point that out. We've got a engineering, design, experimental metaphor that the humans will design a variety of different mechanisms. And Mikayla's pointed to, but what is also true at the same time is because of that, because there's different humans and different groups designing different ones, we've got an evolutionary process with a lot of variety of different constitutional forms and governance forms that are competing with each other for scarce resources, which is basically truths being loaded onto those platforms.
Yeah, bottom up, not top down. That's the key.
So, being on the EOS blockchain, where we have a number of, different rule-making mechanisms, and we have on-chain voting. Could you guys sort of talk a little bit about the problem of voting? Because we definitely have the problem of voting.
Can I just put a preamble on that? One of the sort of questions, one of the sort of parameters that you choose in any constitutional governance system is how much governance to put into the system. So the thing about Bitcoin is there's actually not much. It's the minimal set. It's hard to imagine less governance there. These are the rules, and the basic rule is don't change the rules. And in a weird sort of way, that's the American Constitution's a lot like that as well. Just these are the rules, really hard to change the rules. Now that's good because certainty. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that the rules aren't going to change unless a lot of effort is put in. Therefore, you can build on those rules and bury those rules deep into whatever you're building because they're stable. Now that's a good thing. The problem is that what you've just done is you've just created a tyranny of those rules. So, trade-off, right? Certainty, tyranny. The other extreme is we can make the constitutional rules mostly about how you change the constitutional rules. And you end up with a system that is a rule system that is absolutely designed to optimize on the best rule system. And we've built learning into this constitution. It's got elaborate processes for changing rules. It's got mechanisms, and democracy is an example of that, right? So democracy is an elaborate political process for changing rules. You elect them and you kick them out. What you've just done is you've just made it, now I'm not sure whether those rules are still going to be there in 20 years' time because of all the elaborate rule-changing systems I can see. So what we've just done is we've made a different trade-off there. We've gone for more optimization. This thing will be better. It will get to a better place. But it might not be better because people might not build on it. Or there's just less security and trust. So we've traded, we've gone, okay. So if you choose if you magically happen to get the perfect rule system out of the box, win. That's the best possible win because you've got perfect rules, optimized for all time, and no way to change them. That's the best. So the thing about Bitcoin is we're not sure whether that's the best one. It might be, it might not be. But I think this is, and this is not just a problem in the blockchain space. This is the biggest political problem, of all time. So, an effective tyranny, or sort of hierarchical society, sort of think ancient Egypt, right? Just the king in this a clear sense, lasted for thousands of years, right? It was absolutely stable. You could trust that. Not the best society. There was a lot of misery in that society.
Great architecture.
Well, pointy architecture. It was, yeah. But I mean, I just think this is the problem, right? So in a world of uncertainty and change, you want to build constitutional rules that adapt to that change, but you also want to build rules that never change because that's your bulwark against uncertainty and change. So it's a hard problem. There's no correct solutions. You can build some good rules, strong rules that never change, or you can build a flexible system. But this goes back to the evolutionary. Evolution will sort this out. Yeah. The original question was.
So did I, but that was good. No, it was about the problem. It was about the problem of voting.
So yeah, so voting then fits into that. What is voting? Voting is a mechanism that you design into a governance system to enable information to come in from distributed information to come in and change some rules in the system. Right? So just abstractly, that's what voting is. Voting is an information aggregation mechanism. The only reason you want information aggregation is that you haven't found the perfect person or central point that just is wiser than the aggregate. Right? So yeah. Voting is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And the means that it's serving is information is distributed. We don't know who's right, therefore we aggregate information. Voting is a way to do that.
Yes, and sort of complementing that, to sort of think about it in sort of blockchain and incidentally sort of other spaces. There's the potential for people to express their preferences in a number of ways. Forking has been represented as one example where sort of a cluster of blockchain users have decided to effectively secede from a sort of a given sort of platform to develop something with some other sort of technical features. I mean, that in effect is a form of sort of expression which is encapsulated within the general concept of voting. One of the sort of great dilemmas with voting systems is how you can really sort of possibly or legitimately sort of tie it up with the expression of the intensity of preferences. We all have our sort of different preferences, and then within that we have, you know, stronger or milder intensity and preferences. You know, person A, if you're sort of voting between apple and orange, you know, to eat for breakfast, you know, person A might really intensely want, you know, to vote apple, whereas the other person says, meh, you know. So, you know, the sort of, you know, just having that sort of generalized sort of system of voting doesn't really quite, unless you sort of have complementary institutions like, you know, federalism or secession in blockchain, like forking and so on, doesn't sort of quite enable individuals to be able to register those preferences. There's some very interesting sort of voting experimentation going on within the blockchain space, and one notable one which I would mention is so-called quadratic voting sort of mechanisms where, you know, people can basically, you know, through the sort of purchase of tokens, for example, be able to express their intensity of preferences over a given issue. You know, someone who feels very strongly about an issue can certainly express that strength, that intensity of preference, but the cost of that is that, you know, they must, you know, sort of purchase or accumulate a lot of tokens compared to someone's you know, milder preference. So, so intensity of preferences is, you know, one perennial sort of issue. Traditionally, we've had, you know, politicians, you know, why do we have them? You know, they pretend themselves to sort of divine the political will. They don't do that actually very well. But hopefully mechanisms, emergent mechanisms available through blockchain might enable for more effective voting styles which allow people to express intensity preference.
Can I come in on this? Sorry, Al. We're talking a lot about political theory here, and it's not an accident. We've got a theory that we've been developing that the entire blockchain space in a very short amount of time is going to replicate the last 300 years of human political experience. It'll make all the same mistakes and it'll get all the same ways. So it starts off with direct democracy, which is the Athenian concept of every citizen votes directly for whatever. Then it'll realize that the problem with direct democracy is that you lack specialization, that you don't have, you know, representatives can specialize in being agents. Then you'll end up with the formation of political parties. Political parties are basically ways to enable complex vote trading amongst issues. So just, in the blockchain space, we're not at the political parties yet. We're only just past direct democracy, heading into representative democracy. But what our theory is there's a famous theory in biology called, what is it? Phylogeny recapitulates ontology, or the other way around. But what it basically says is that the development of an embryo in an organism recapitulates the entire evolutionary experience of the historical experience of long history. And we think the same thing will happen with blockchain governance, is that blockchain governance will more or less replicate, for the same reasons, that collective decision making is hard, there are no perfect solutions, and you just have to work this out by long, painful experiences, experiments. Now, the thing about our collective process of experimentation is that's what we call war, civil revolutions. You know, it's been enormously costly, these experiments. So what's amazing is that we can do this much faster, much cheaper. The point that we want to make is we should learn from the ones that we've actually done in the political nation building and destroying space, because the same problems are arising. And this is why, you know, we're here talking about blockchain governance, but we've been using the language of political governance because it's the same thing. Groups of people come together and make rules that are hard to make to solve hard problems about creating social order.
And yeah, and I mean, taking it back to voting, one of the problems that we know with voting, especially one person, one vote, which is what most democratic system, which is the system that most democratic systems work under, is that voting is really costly. And this is part of the problem of the Athenian system of voting. This is part of the problem with representative voting, is it actually costs the voter a lot of time and effort to actually figure out the merits of who they're voting for and whether they should vote for a certain thing or not. Because the thing is, most people know that their individual vote won't actually count. So at the margin, your individual vote won't make a difference to the aggregate of the election. So this is why we have something called the rational, this is why voters are basically rationally ignorant. So a lot of voters, not all voters, some voters are very passionate about politics and as such, so they derive a lot of satisfaction out of being part of the political process. But a lot of voters just say, listen, this is not for me. I know my vote doesn't count, so I'm not going to figure out anything about the political candidates who are up for grabs this election. I'm just going to vote for C, or I'm going to vote for the guy or girl whose name starts with D, or I'm going to vote for whoever. And I think the reason why this is relevant, especially for blockchain-based systems, is because of proof-of-stake and delegated proof-of-stake systems. Because we have, especially in the case of EOS, we have EOS token holders voting for EOS block producers. And often, especially these very, very small token holders who might not have many EOS at all, they need to actually consciously go out and figure out what these EOS block producers are, what they stand for, whether or not they're a good candidate to vote for. So these are just some of the political science theories that we're going to be taking from the last 300 years.
I'm going to elaborate on that. So
Please do.
What Al was, the message he was putting across, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but economists hate voting. Political scientists love it because it's, civic duty and so on. But economists look at it and go, that's just irrational. Why would your chance of affecting the vote is the number of people whose vote has actually broken a tie. Like if maybe in this room we could vote, and it might be, do we have more pizza or less pizza, and we might come down to one person's vote will split the tie. But once you get up to sort of millions and so on, it's just the chances of a vote actually splitting a tie is just infinitesimal. That's the sense in which your vote doesn't count. Therefore, voting is irrational. Therefore, voting is a consumption behavior. You're doing it, the technical word is it's expressive voting, but you're doing it for other reasons than maybe to avoid a fine or to, because it's tribal identities or whatever, right? But this is a long-winded way of saying voting doesn't actually work. And the reason we like it is not because it works well in optimal decision theory, is that it's an effective mechanism for correcting mistakes. It's not actually that effective a mechanism for making good choices. So voting is a mechanism of eliminating bad agents or governments, not a mechanism for choosing good ones. Now, that's a hard-won lesson that every civilized democracy knows. But we keep it because that's the best way. The other way is revolution. And revolution is expensive in a whole new class of pain and suffering. So voting is the best, worst, the worst, best, worst. It's solution, right? Now, okay, so now we've gone, okay, that's voting. Now let's do it, now let's use voting. So yay, voting. And let's use voting now to govern blockchains. What's just happened is we've chosen the best worst solution to do this. Therefore, we should expect that voting will be effective, not for choosing the best producers, but for eliminating the worst producers. That will be a reasonable expectation of how we can use voting in a decentralized governance protocol mechanism, is to get rid of bad producers or nodes in a system, not to pick the best nodes. And any belief that this will be a system that will pick the best nodes is just naive. Or, I mean, maybe it will be true, but it will be the first time in history that this has ever worked. If you want to pick the best ones, you want to design a mechanism that will select experts, and then those experts will use their expertise to select the best ones. Problem with that system is that that's the worst system for getting rid of bad nodes, because that's effortlessly corruptible, that system. So, pick one, right? Do we want, but the point is, the reason everyone hates economists is that what we're essentially saying is that there's no easy solutions here. Everything is problematic, and it's really about trying to just figure out what it is you want to avoid the most, and then we'll design a system around that. Now, is it eliminating bad nodes? If that's the case, voting will work. Is it picking the best ones? In that case, voting is the worst. Yeah.
Well, if it's eliminating bad nodes, it's not quite working yet, I don't think. But we'll see.
It barely works in real politics either. Like, there's still a lot of bad nodes in our political system, despite the fact that voting is compulsory and you go to prison if you don't vote. No, we can't vote any harder than we do, and still full of bad nodes in the real world. So, but again, I'm just saying these are hard problems we're trying to solve, and there are no magical solutions. And unless we just accidentally happen to awesomely pick the perfect set of institutional rules out of the box first time. And a lot of people in the community believe we have. And I really hope that's true. I super hope that's true. But I doubt it.
So, just before we get to question time, I just wanted to cover one more thing. Where does the DAO fit in with all of this discussion? And maybe you could also explain what it is.
Yeah, so the DAO is essentially a thing you can do with smart contracts. So smart contracts are essentially things you can do with blockchain. And in essence, you can write code that takes a promise to do a thing in the future and embeds it in such a way that you can't unpromise that. Once you promise it, you write it there, it's going to happen. That's a smart contract. A DAO is when you go, I wonder what would happen if we bundled together a bunch of promises. What you've just done is you've created effectively an organization. That's a DAO. So it's basically a way of creating organizational governance by engineering bundles of smart contracts into a structure that brings people together to do a thing. Now, what a DAO competes with is the perfectly familiar idea you've got of a boss who bundles together a bunch of contracts, people, and gives them direction in the future. So, sometimes bosses are good, they're flexible, but they're unpredictable. They can, they're also difficult to control. This is the principal agent problem that Thomas spoke about before. You know what that term refers to? So, principal agent problem, it's a term of art in game theory and economics, which just says that a lot of situations you want someone else to act on your behalf. You're the principal, they're the agent. The reason you want to do that is you lack expertise or knowledge or time or effort, or there's just reasons you want someone else to act on your behalf. The principal agent problem is you've got your interests, your preferences, the things you want, they've got theirs. It's hard to align those. And because they're acting on your behalf, they can also act in their interest. So principal agent problems are just absolutely rife in the world. They're the reason we have organizations in the first place, monitoring. They're the reasons we have democracy. A politician is an agent. You're the principal, they're the agent. Democracy is the mechanism to punish them if they start deviating from what you want them to do. Principal agent problems are hard to solve. What is a DAO? A solution, a powerful solution to a principal agent problem by just going, whatever agency you've got in that system, it is absolutely, it can't deviate from what you want it or tell it to do. So,
should we be thinking about the whole Bitcoin protocol as a DAO then? It is just an autonomously governed thing. There's very minimal input. The only input from the meat world is when people say, I want to transact this Bitcoin to there. It does it automatically with no other input. It'll run without any central party. There's no censorship. Is Bitcoin just not the simplest of the DAOs? I just thought of this then, so if this is wrong, then please feel free to tell me. But I mean, is a DAO just something that governs itself autonomously based on certain rules and parameters, and it just happens?
Oh, I mean, DAO, literally decentralized autonomous organization, so yes, in that sense. But generally what we mean by DAO is things that we're building on that DAO. So you can build DAOs on DAOs then, if that's the case.
What I'd probably want to emphasise here is the potential versatility of such constellations of mutual agreements that are represented in sort of smart contracts. Now, some of the research that we're focusing on, the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub, include representations of, DAOs to promote, social assistance. So you sort of get, DAO versions of, well, the analog charity, and then you see, lots of other sort of versions of replicants of sort of types of firms and types of organisations in the analog, so-called real world in that space. And what's interesting, we sort of, a couple of us at the Hub have a paper coming out in the Journal of Public Finance and Public Choice, where we sort of talk about the relationship of sort of DAOs in, what we call our sort of structured living togetherness that we call entangled political economy. So where, politics is deeply intertwined with our economics, is deeply intertwined with our society, is deeply intertwined with our, science and culture and so on and so forth. Blockchain may not only replicate, some of those structures, like firms or whatever that we actually see in the analog world, but people can effectively, if you like, crypto secede, along various margins away from the real world and sort of self-organise themselves through DAOs in blockchain spaces to prosecute more effectual economic and social impact, and they serve as sort of distinguishing features from sort of the analog institutions that we have. The analog world, providing, cooperation and also, some senses collaboration as well. So I think this is why they're important. They just add really to the ecological diversity of how, well, we organise ourselves, how we govern ourselves.
So another way of seeing that point is just that, the world is made of organisations, right? We all are part of them. It's just they've always been really expensive. Right, so nations are expensive to make. You need an army and you need all sorts of land and stuff. Companies are expensive to make. You need lawyers and boards and all sorts of things. Just clubs are, you follow the law. Organizations are expensive to make and build, but organizations are really useful when a group of people comes together to want to do a thing, right? This is how we make value, as humans come together, they combine their knowledge to do something. One way to think about DAOs, as Mikayla was pointing to, is just a phenomenal fall in the cost of making organizations. Now, basic economics predicts, demand curve slope downwards. When the cost of something falls, you do more of it. What this predicts is not so much, and now there's DAOs in the world, but now, even forget the word DAO, just organizations just got a whole lot cheaper. Therefore, we're likely to build a whole lot more of them, which means at the moment, you've got one job, you're in one country, you may be in 3 clubs, you're in one family, maybe an extended, at most 10 organizations that you're in. That might not be the optimal number. The optimal number might be 100 or 1,000. It's just, given the current cost of building organizations, 10 is the number that we're in. So therefore, we only get the benefit of 10 organizations. That's a reason to be optimistic, that this is our general perspective on this is actually not neutral. We're very excited about this technology, not just because of some sort of innate techno-optimism, but just because of just basic economics. It predicts that a lot of the things that we like, governance, order, value, organizations, just got cheaper. Therefore, we'll have more of them. That's good, right? That's an exciting thing. Hard thing, we've got to figure out how to build them. Difficult thing, because these are competing with existing ones. But just the broad outline of, is this on net good or bad? Just this is phenomenally net good as a prediction. But yeah, that's where we are.
Thanks, guys. That's awesome. I'm going to throw it out to the audience now. Feel free to ask any questions you like. We've got, hey John.
Do you think blockchain is death to capitalism or existing form of government?
Yeah.
And going forward, you think physical or geographical location of the countries will change?
Yes to both. We've actually written about this. We think we're entering post-capitalism. And the postness of post-capitalism here actually goes back to, I'm going to tell the story. The thing about capitalism is it's got capital in it, right? And how you make capital in capitalism is you build an organization, and that organization is a legal entity that accumulates capital. Now, the first capitalist organizations were to build railways and steel mills, just things that required a lot of capital to be accumulated in an organization, right? Now, that required joint stock companies and shareholders, which created the need for long-lived organizations, long-lived hierarchies. Long-lived hierarchies created long-term labor contracts, which created unions, which created so now we've got these big long-lived things on the capital and labor side, which then required regulation because there's a lot of power that's just been created. So, modern capitalism is basically bound up with the idea of the need to build organizations to accumulate resources into one place to govern those resources. That's capitalism, right? Now, with its regulatory responses. What we just did, so a lot of people talk about the benefits of, or the nature of blockchain is disintermediation. That it takes out the middle agent, or it disintermediates, so now you've got peer-to-peer rather than a third party. We think that actually misses the point. The real thing it does is it de-hierarchicalizes. De-hierarchicalization. De-hierarchicalization is what a DAO does. It enables an organization to form using a protocol rather than a hierarchy, right? Now, I know we call this yet, but capitalism was named by its enemies. It was named by Karl Marx, who meant it as a slur, he meant it as a bad word, to describe, look at the accumulation of capital. And what he was looking at specifically was look at this concentration of power in this organizational hierarchy with bosses at the top and so on. In a sense, he was right. I mean, I'm as free market as it gets, but he was right about that. What we've just done is we've built a technology that enables us to have economic coordination without the need for economic hierarchicalization and all of the problems it causes, including power asymmetries and all of the sort of costs of capitalism that that have resulted, political parties on each side and so on, and regulatory responses to control it, and active media to monitor it, and democracies to, all of those things are costs. We think of them as good because they protect us, but they're costs. So yes to post-capitalism, definitely. What this will look like is, my guess is actually, this is where it gets weird. We've been here before. It'll look more like empire, where we're going. What is an empire? An empire is just a common set of rules that applies across multiple cultures and lands. So the Roman Empire was in essence Roman law applied to whomever got conquered, right? What Roman law basically was mercantile law that enabled trade across those things, and then Roman infrastructure and so on. It was a commercial infrastructural project that also involved slavery. But that notion of empire as a way of thinking about what's being built now is not a completely misleading metaphor. Now, what a blockchain is kind of a infrastructural platform for creating social truth upon which we can build organizations and money and contracts and so on. So that doesn't stop at a geographical border or a cultural border. It just stops where the trade stops, or it stops where people stop wanting to join. So it's a, in the sense of, and I think that's also the right context to think about the multi-chain world. How many blockchains? How many empires? These things can be overlapping, there can be shifting boundaries, but that's the new thing, which then answers your second question, or addresses the second question, what happens to nation states? We still need to live in a physical world, but we might not need them as much. Now that's a problem if you're a nation state, which most things, because there's, the other aspect of it is nation states actually aren't that, historically they're unusual. We've had them for about 200 years. 300-ish?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can I just sort of add to those three sort of quick observations? So we're sort of trying to discover, and maybe you can help, with a sort of nice word that sort of explains the posited properties of blockchain and de-hierarchicalizing. I'm offering debossing, right? So basically, blockchain provides an opportunity to sidestep the sort of the analog hierarchies, and they're thereby, in doing so, sort of engaging in a process of debossing. In terms of the notion of sort of empire building, now I think what's quite sort of subtly distinct here in the blockchain context is that the blockchain users will actually want to buy in, right, to those sort of protocols and relatable sort of systems which have been sort of proven in an evolutionary sort of sense to work. So, the Roman Empire, as distinct from the Roman Empire, which was imposed upon the Gauls and, other people in the Middle East and so on and so forth, the notion of a sort of a blockchain sort of governance empire is one of fundamentally buy-in, right? So sort of fundamentally reflects, I go back to James Buchanan, sort of his constitutional project was about, well, constitutions are people buy into mutual agreement, right? So, this is probably a much better empire than the Roman Empire, for all of its sort of, for all of its architecture. And so I had a sort of third point about the nation state, which I've forgotten.
But that's a good observation. This is imagine a world of empires where you chose voluntarily your empire and could leave one at will any time, right? That's the voluntary aspect to this. Now, that's another way of saying peaceful.
Yeah, a good way to think about it. So traditionally, in the meat space, you've got three opportunities to influence the polity that you're in. So you've got exit, voice, and loyalty. So exit means you just leave. That can be quite expensive. You can't leave all of the time. You don't necessarily want to up and go. Your government might not want you to go, and so on. Voice is exercising, your political voice, so campaigning for certain things, and then the part is just, loyalty. You're happy. Now we have forking as well. So we've basically got a fourth option, and the good thing is it's very peaceful. So all of the things that we're talking about here are peaceful, but as Jason and Mikayla have been alluding to, the previous instances that we've been able to that we've had to do these things in the political sphere have been very, very violent. So they've been wars, revolutions, civil wars.
Let this not sound too Pollyanna-ish as well. In the past, the benefits of war and the benefits of violence, in terms of just acquiring resources, were very real. But the reason for that is because in the past, most resources were physical: cows, land, crops, whatever. The more that the value in the modern world becomes digital and is essentially tied up in knowledge and so on, that stuff you just actually can't acquire by force. You actually have to bid people in. It has to voluntarily come to you. So, in a sense, nation states were kind of a response to all of the local violence and raiding and so on that was taking place in the Middle Ages, where a nation state is basically a strong king rises up and goes, I will protect my citizens from the marauding bandits within this space, because there were marauding bandits and because the citizens needed protection. Now, how you protect things is you secure the ledger. You establish property rights, and you enable those property rights to be not just secure, but useful, tradable, on a global scale. So this process of providing security for your citizens is now actually largely about building trade infrastructure. And again, along comes blockchain into this world at exactly the right time, when by and large, most of the wealth and value in the world exists inside people's heads, in skills, in digital assets, it's invisible. It's not, this land is still valuable, trees are still important things in the world. You can still rustle sheep if you want, but that's not the main source of wealth in society.
Can I just, no, I actually now remember my third point about the nation state, and to answer your question about speculatively how blockchain might affect the future nation state. So, the first order effect is that, as Jason rightly points out, blockchain might mean that we need nation states less. But, in a very sort of speculative sort of frame that I'm about to explicate, there's probably second order effects. Incumbent politicians will recognise the threat of blockchain. Some will obviously try to shut it down, sort of shut down cryptocurrency activity, etc. Others will actually respond and in a very constructive way to the onset of blockchain by becoming much more service-oriented, seeing the citizen as customers, right? And this sort of harkens back, if you're, as I am sort of interested in fiscal sociology, thinking about, sort of how public finance systems worked in the past. In the Middle Ages, in some part of the Middle Ages, there was the cameralist kind of system of public finance, and what that was that in Europe you basically had princes who owned land and real property, things that are valuable, and how they got their revenue, right, was essentially by buying and by selling basically the land and the bits of property, rather than the modernist sort of system of revenue collection, which is income tax or GST or whatever. So in the potential threat, crypto secession, everyone going into the blockchain space, governments will, want to become much more sort of customer focused, like the cameralists of old, and want to engage in the populace in that way. So you sort of get the real sort of, that sort of real competition. This, French classical liberals, Charles de Neuilly, he made sort of remark about, the ultimate vision, I guess the libertarian vision of government is that the world is municipalized, and what that means is that, governments don't become anymore these, top-down hierarchicalist, centralized sort of entities, sort of threaten you with tax and surveil the life out of you and so on. They actually become sort of genuine, sort of like firms, basically very customer oriented, very eager to please you, and that might be speculatively, high speculation, one of the sort of potential impacts of blockchain on government if people are opting out of the current analog systems of governance.
Yeah, and that could be things like, monetary constitutionalism, which, Bitcoin is a competitor now to fiat currencies. And, Satoshi Nakamoto clearly didn't like what Federal Reserves did and what central banking did in the whole. So we may even see fiat currencies being restricted or constrained in, how much money they actually print, how much money they're actually creating through QE programs. So we may see things like, monetary constitutionalism, because they are now under threat of competition from valid competitors in the private space now.
Any other questions? How's it going? Oops, how's it going? I'm probably a bit concerned that we might be sounding like we're overselling the benefit of blockchain by saying it's going to change government and change the world and all this sort of stuff. Because we just spoke about the problems of human beings in general, and what we're seeing with, for example, the fork of Bitcoin Cash is that yes, the power has changed, but the power's gone to other people, which is people who have the power to buy the machines and they have the wealth in marketing to influence in a different way. So so in the blockchain world, there are now established leaders or lords in the space. So nothing's changed very much in the way, in terms of power. And there is a power difference, even just between me and the next developer, because someone who can understand how to do things has power immediately over someone who don't. So education is very important. If we lift the overall education level of everyone, particularly from a technical perspective, then so things hasn't changed very much. Yes, there is now a write-only database which is useful for recording things, smart contracts are actually not that smart, like rules of life is fairly complex and just yes-no answers in the case of smart contracts. So it's a long way to asking two questions. One is, this world that you're talking about, how long would it take to get there? And I guess from an academic perspective or education institution perspective, what are the priorities that RMIT or otherwise organisations are putting forward to make sure that we could get to that point in a smooth way and not unnecessarily overselling what the thing is at the moment? Because ultimately, especially with the market down as it is now, there is really nothing useful in blockchain at the moment apart from some crypto trading or crypto transactions, and overall it's still fairly small. So two questions again: how long will we get there, and what are the priorities?
Yeah, I mean, this are good questions. We're still in the experimental phase. I know it's painful sometimes to do this, but you really have to look away from the market dynamics that are happening right now, as they're not reflecting mature market dynamics. And there's not actually that much information in price movements to feed through into this. Just back to your first point, these power imbalances that you speak of, some people know more than others and so on, that's the human condition. Right? That's true regardless of everything. When we're designing constitutional governance systems, we're designing those systems from the assumption that that's the human condition we're dealing with from the beginning. If we start with the presumption that if only people are all exactly equal or exactly truthful or honest, we wouldn't actually need governance systems. We could just rely on people to just do what's right and make promises and off we go. We only need governance systems because of these differences, flaws, whatever the state that we're starting with. So, I think it's a bit harsh to sort of start with that observation that there are these difficulties or just fundamental differences in people coming into this. The real sort of significance of this is what happens next. I mean, can these systems harness the differences between people, put them to good use? Can they create organizations that have a lot of values that we would like inclusivity and cooperation and so on? Can they build those types of organizations to enable people to come together to do things better than the ones that we've currently got? And that's the relevant comparison. I think this is what we're going to find out. We're going to find out where that works, where it doesn't work, what scale it works. We're going to also learn things about the quality of the existing organizations we've got that we might not have been able to see because we'd never had anything to compare them to. But just, and the point I'm sort of making here is that we're very much in an experimental phase of new institutional and governance building. And the role that we see, our role at RMIT as a research center, is just to describe that, to really just try and, in a very clear sense, describe what we're seeing in front of us and what we're seeing as potential. And as I was saying before, I'm aware that we might have sounded a bit that this is some kind of sort of completely rosy future that just takes us out of the dark ages into the bright future, but it's not. What it does is it gives us new options. And our economic analysis of those new options say, on many margins, they look pretty good. Organizations get cheaper, promises should work better. Up to us what we do with them. Up to us to figure out where the best applications of those are and so on. So what that means is that the main thing I'm excited about is that this is happening at a global scale, that we're seeing a lot of experimentation in a lot of things. The lesson that Mikayla didn't get to with the Cambrian explosion is that 99% of everything died. Just every time we have a huge explosion of new ideas and evolutionary advance that we look back on and go, wow, that was the beginning of everything. 99% of everything died. It was to find the 1% within that space. So this is almost a universal law of nature. This is what we see in startup space. We see this with every new technology has this adoption curve. But what you see at the beginning is a wild explosion of creative diversity, hard to tell what's going to work, and then we figure that out as we go, as the selection kicks in. Most of the things that we're building right now will die. We just don't know which ones, and we really don't know which ones. We have to build them to find out. So that kind of experimental mentality, that's why I respect this build quickly, fail quickly, move on. I like the idea that companies blow up. Companies failing is good. It means you're releasing resources back into the ecosystem. Companies or ideas that should die but don't is the worst possible outcome, because you've got talented people doing things that not being released back in. What is market capitalism? Market capitalism is basically a system for correcting failure. What is democracy? It's basically a system for correcting failure. What are we right now? We're at the massive amounts of variety phase, and the next phase is always a whole lot of killing things off. Maybe that started already. If so, that's great. That's a sign we're moving on. But this kind of evolutionary massive disruption and uncertainty is entirely normal from a growth perspective.
I'll just sort of try to address more concretely the unequalizing sort of relations that you sort of touch on. We would invite anyone to engage in a comparative institutional perspective to compare, for example, the unequalizing concentrated network relations occurring within blockchain, and then compare that against, I don't know, maybe the financial system in Australia, for example, the big four. So I think, in some extents, depending on which way you look, those sort of relations that are emergent within blockchain space as unequalizing as they might be, because in effect, you have to recognise rewards that are given to entrepreneurial creativity and so on and so forth, have to be compared against the unequalising kludge, right, that emerges as a consequence of sort of legacy, sort of analogue sort of institutions. Thinking about sort of things like the hardware you use for mining and so on and so forth. Well, we know generally with ICT that the real prices of such items have fallen drastically, and this sort of gets to an important sort of part of the story that Jason sort of touches upon. If we sort of presume that blockchain adoption takes on a sort of mass scale rather than sort of, I don't know, the 1 to 5% to 8% of the world today, then we would expect, that sort of mass participation to be conducive to a corrosion of initially unequalizing sort of relations, within blockchain space, especially in the origination sort of phase of evolution as things get progressively adopted. And finally, just so one final thing, if I may, just quickly, there are numerous ways to interpret inequality. Shameless plug as I do in my famous book on inequality, published this year. There are many ways to actually think about inequality. Jason referred to the terms of inclusiveness and participation. Now, to the extent that people can actually potentially mass participate in blockchain, I see that as pro-equalising. Pro-equalising.
Can I say, anyone can go to RMIT and get a finance degree, work on top of that, and become the CEO one day. So it's quite accessible.
Yeah. And that, sort of the greater, so there are huge awareness gaps in terms of understanding of blockchain, but and education and training will help fill that gap in the end. But indeed, in itself, mass education and training, both formal and tacit, will in itself contribute to a greater equality of relations that occurs in the blockchain space, including the labour markets, as everyone knows the skills in the long run.
I'll make this closed questions. Recently we've seen Bitcoin explode, price go up. We know by its inception that you have to mine it to create it, so that got everyone mining it. That keeps it safe by having all the nodes spread out. Then you see big firms like Chinese investors putting in heaps and heaps of these mining rigs. Then you see the small investors go out. So that means that they can control most of the hash rates. So I see that as a critical flaw to use. And secondly, would it make sense to maybe just move to an empire blockchain, one that does all, and have it so the hashes are done on the point of sale system rather than people doing the hash rates? Because wherever people are involved, there's mistakes. Wherever the machine's involved, usually there isn't a mistake.
So I've got a very specific, distinct opinion on this. I think the correct response is we shouldn't care, because evolutionary processes of selection will sort this out. So Bitcoin's working, it's going up, more miners are coming in, mining pools are starting to form, it's starting to re-centralize, it collapses, boom. Let's just think of that as a natural process, and which creates opportunities for better governance systems to emerge into that space. If it had kept on succeeding, we would never have had EOS, for instance. The whole point of failure is it creates space for new things to come along. So I think it's very dangerous to think of this from a top-down engineering, what should we do to create the perfect system perspective. That's kind of a recipe for, well, one, it's hubris, but it's also, it denies evolutionary learning process, or it denies distributed learning processes and building new systems, seeing what fail. The best way to figure out what the best system is to build it and see how it breaks, right? That's how you do engineering, is you build something, you fly it as fast as you can into a wall, and you see where it breaks, and you build it again so it doesn't do that, but it makes new mistakes. This process of just build, test, break, build it again, wasteful, expensive. Looking backwards, we can say, we should have just built the correct one right from the start. But the thing is, a message that we've really tried to drive home this evening is, these are hard problems we're trying to solve. These are phenomenal. These are the hardest problems. No one knows the correct solution to these things. The best we can do is design robust mechanisms to correct mistakes and failure. So what I want, my perspective on what a good system, what a good ecology would look like, is one that quickly corrects mistakes or quickly eliminates things that aren't working. If Bitcoin is centralizing and becoming at risk of totalitarian, I want it to die as fast as possible. If it's not doing that, if it's growing strongly and people are using it, I want it to keep growing and absorb more resources so it can do that. What I don't want to do is to have some kind of, okay, that's the one, let's lock that one in and all go home and just hope that we've picked the right one. That's again, going back to what is market capitalism. It's an experimental system. It's an experimental protocol. What is democracy? It's an experimental protocol. I like the idea that we've got lots of things competing and they're fighting with each other, and there's loyalties and alliances breaking, and we never quite know which one is going to win. That's messy. It's chaotic. I like it at work. That's a robust sort of situation. Now, what I don't want is us making political decisions about this, or sort of having significant power and going, okay, we'll let the government choose the correct one. This is what makes me nervous about national cryptocurrencies or things like that. Is that there's just it's, if we pick the right one and it's a perfect one and we get it out of the box perfectly, that's awesome. But it was just highly statistically unlikely that's where we'll end up.
Yeah, we shouldn't think that just because Bitcoin was the first one and it's been around for 10 years successfully, that it has to be the one. I think that's the danger.
But at the same time, it might be the one.
It
right?
could be. Yeah.
We're not ruling.
Yeah, but we shouldn't have some vendor lock-in to Bitcoin per se. And of course it does have problems around centralized mining. I don't necessarily have a big opinion around the centralized mining part of Bitcoin per se, but it is interesting the way that the miners actually sometimes, the miners are conscious. They know that their incentive is to make sure that people don't think that it's centralized. So what is interesting is the way that they will pare back their hash rate when it does get too close to 50%, or one miner or one mining pool having close to 50%. So it is interesting to see the reactions of these big miners, because they know that this is a voluntary system where people can leave if it's controlled by a Roger Ver type figure.
And just a sort of final observation, I certainly endorse the sentiment expressed by my colleagues about the virtue of failure and mistakes themselves, because it allows people like you and me to actually observe those behaviours and improve upon those. And the beauty of blockchain is that, like markets generally, diverse ecologies of human interaction, is that they are a redemptive process, right? You make a mistake, you're not dead. I mean, you have another opportunity tomorrow, right, to learn upon the so-called mistake, right, and move forward more prosperously. But I probably, in this case and in closing, I'd probably adopt the sentiment of that very wise sage Yoda, when he says, the greatest teacher, failure be.
That's a good note to finish on. I think we'll finish there. Firstly, thank you to all of you to come out tonight and listen to us. And if you could all give a round of applause to the three of these guys from RMIT. Thanks a lot. We can also think of Thomas. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring out as many excerpts as I would have liked, but we couldn't help talking so much. So that's the way it goes, isn't it? So the only thing I had to say was, on the table there's some black and white EOSphere t-shirts. This is the black one. There's only a few there, but if you're keen on getting a good quality t-shirt, because Ross really likes good quality t-shirts, so it's a great t-shirt. Go and grab one if you like, and you can follow us on Twitter, EOSphere, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. Just before you go, can you please help and join me to thank Chris P. and the team at EOSphere for bringing this up tonight. So thank you so much. And from us at the Blockchain Center, thank you to the RMIT Innovation Hub. I always love an event where I can have political science, biology, and economics in one, plus the future tech, plus having to say in disintermediation and de-hierarchalization was a fantastic thing to learn. So thank you all so much, and may the blockchain be with you.